Um, a short snippet of a Bach saraband in D minor. Um, D minor is the key of Kol Nidre, so D minor is very much on my mind. And it's going to lead into an arrangement by Sam Adler, who great American composer and pedagogue, composition pedagogue of Adon Olam.
Oh, wow.
Beautiful, Adria. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Beautiful way to
Welcome.
start today.
You're welcome.
And before we jump into the discussion that I'm going to lead following yesterday's very important questions, I wonder if Ruthie Berman is here. I think I saw her before. Ruthie, are you here? Ruthie is. I asked her to tell us a little bit about her history with Psalm 27. If Ruthie is here,
I think I just saw her arrive. Let's see. Do we see her under participants? Ruth.
She is here.
Ruthie, if you need to unmute yourself and then you can talk. She is here.
There we go.
There you are.
I
Good
just
morning,
came-
Ruthie.
Let me take a deep breath. I just came from another meeting. Emergency services of Palm Beach County. That's all the fire department. Oh, God. Okay.
Take a breath. Take a breath.
I had shared with Rabbi Kleinbaum that Psalm 27 is my favorite and means a great deal to me, and I've carried it with me, not necessarily the words, but the whole idea of how it happened. I was in ninth grade. Should I show off a little? It was the SP class. And the teacher, and I don't know why.
Tell us what school were you in?
Oh, junior high school junior high school 209.
Was that Sheepshead Bay?
No, that was Brownsville, Brooklyn. Okay, and the English teacher began to teach us the Psalm 27 musically. We had no idea this was Psalm 27 musically until much later in my life. And she just loved it and had such a vivaciousness about it. But the language was beautiful because the repetition of the words, and what did I do with them? The repetition of the words was what has kept me moving in my life, though I may have been punched in the stomach or slapped in the face, and I don't mean literally, but the situation that I had in my life. And the repetition of the words, particular particular statement is what also keeps me kissing the mezuzah coming and going. And that is, and I'll sing it as best I can in repetition. The Lord is the strength of my life. The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom then shall I be afraid? Would you believe I used to be in the chorus many years ago?
Beautiful. You sing beautifully, Ruthie. Keep going.
Though a host of men are laid against me, when then shall I be afraid? Again, the Lord is the strength of my life. The Lord is the strength of my life. The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom then shall I be afraid? So I don't necessarily use in my life, in my heart, in my vision, the word Lord.
Right.
But there is a sense of that spirit that helps me. It helps me. And I have been with it since 9th grade. She taught it to us because we were going to sing this in the assembly. Can you imagine that? Yeah. And probably 99.9% of us had no clue, real clue how important these words were in our lives.
And look at that. So what year was that, Ruthie? So it's since 9th grade. That's a long time ago.
14. I'm 86. You tell me.
I can't do math.
72 years ago.
What?
72 years ago.
So 72 years, Psalm 27. You've been singing that setting, those words of Psalm 27, and they've been giving you strength all these years.
Whenever I've also met it in service or whatever, it's very moving.
Beautiful. So beautiful.
I'm glad you gave me a chance to prepare, only because if I was spontaneous, I would be crying. So I'm okay.
And you know, that's very rare that I give people a chance to prepare. It was only because I was on the phone with Ruthie last night. So,
Rabbi, and I thank all of you for listening.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for sharing that. It just adds another whole deep layer for me. And I just love that. I'd love to track down that setting. It sounds really beautiful. All right. So today I'm going to answer the question in a somewhat abbreviated form, but I hope it will clarify the question. What's the relationship of Judaism to Christianity? And that came up yesterday as we discussed. I can't even remember how it came up, but I know that was the question I was asked to answer. It sounds like it's a more complicated question than it is, and it's actually not that complicated, but it takes a lot of background, some of which we've discussed. I want to give you the headline first, and then I'm going to go backwards, because I want you, Harold, would you put up the thing about Rabbinic Judaism? And yes, Harold helped prepare slides. I promised Harold I will learn how to do this one day. I have not yet done it.
You have me.
Okay, let's look at this first slide. This is the Ikar. This is the essential thing that I want you to understand, and I'm going to explain how. Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism are cousins, siblings, or siblings, depending on which metaphor you want to use. And there are good reasons for both, but that's not the important thing. What does that mean? They both emerged. How do I do that in the camera? Both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism emerged at the same time. I'm going to get into that more, but this is the kind of take-home bumper sticker. Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism emerged roughly in the same couple of hundreds of years. Both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism are heirs to the biblical Israelite religion, and both argue that each is the legitimate heir. And hence, that's where the tension comes in. Because you might say, well, why aren't cousins and siblings so happy to be together, right? The tension comes in is because theologically each argues that they are the legitimate heir. And Christians then argue that that Jews rejected Christianity and they can't be saved. But that's a different theological issue. So what do I mean by that? First of all, biblical Israelite religion is not Judaism. Now, sometimes you'll hear I mix up the words because it's simpler. But if you're a student of religion or a student of the history of religion or a student of Judaism from the academic field as opposed to the theological one only, you will distinguish between biblical Israelite religion and Judaism. Judaism is a rabbinic creation. There is no Judaism in the Bible. I'm saying this very harshly to kind of make it's a little fuzzier than that, but I'm making a very strict line in order to kind of make a point, because I'm trying to do in one short session some things that are obviously takes years of study of history. There are some really good textbooks about this issue, but rabbinic Judaism comes from biblical Israelite religion and Christianity comes from biblical Israelite religion. So it is not true to say that Christianity comes from Judaism, which is what a lot of people like to say. I do not like the phrase Judeo-Christian for that reason. Also, they are two distinct traditions that come from a similar, they come from the same place, but they diverge, and they diverge radically. Both argue they are legitimate heirs. We'll see that in all different kinds of ways. So Judaism says there is especially Orthodox Judaism, but Judaism in general says there's a straight line from the Bible to what I do today. And Christianity says there's a straight line from the Bible to what I do today. Jesus supplanted it, and we no longer have to do things in that Bible because Jesus has supplanted it. Okay, the next slide. Before we go to Judaism, thank you. How to understand Christianity. Modern contemporary Christianity bears almost zero resemblance to early Christian, the early Christian time. So most scholars of religion will talk about early Christianity as pre-Constantine. Constantine marks a break in the development of Christianity. Constantine becomes Christian himself, and then he converts his whole empire, and Christianity is very different from 325 onward to what it was for the first 300 years. And you will see, by the way, in a lot of progressive and feminist Christian theologians, they'll talk about what the original Christianity was, what the original Christian ethos and culture was, and try to go back to it, because they will argue that Constantine and the later church fathers eroded some of the values of the early Christian church. That's a whole other issue and very interesting, but not for today. So to understand early Christianity, which is not something most Jews even have a clue about, is that early Christianity is divided into two fundamental periods. The 3 years that Jesus was ministering and being what we know of as Jesus of Nazareth, being the person he was, roughly 3 years. And again, everybody can argue about the specifics here, but roughly Jesus's ministry was 3, maybe 5, maybe 6 years. And then what we call the apostolic period, which is when the apostles were still alive. So the period of Jesus's life when he was doing his thing, and then the period of the apostles is considered one period. And then the second period is after the apostles are dead, up until Constantine. So these 300 years-ish are what the original or early years of Christianity is. Now, what was happening in Judaism around this period? And this goes back to, if we think that Jesus was born around 0, right? That's our rough, or 1, or whatever. There are a lot of arguments about that, or 3. You know, that period, we know that the temple was destroyed 70 of the Common Era, right? So just kind of overlay Jewish history in this. So during the time of Jesus and the apostolic period, there was a lot of Jewish Christians. It wasn't so rigidly defined. Christianity was one of many, we believe, small religious responses to the chaos of the period. This was a very, very politically tumultuous period, and often in very politically tumultuous and economic scarcity, all of those things. A lot of different religious traditions are percolating. Some survive long time, some merge and combine, and some die off. So that's another thing to remember. Nothing is like clean, like, oh, it's like, I'm Joseph Smith, I'm starting Mormonism. It's all fuzzier than that, especially when it's so tumultuous. And in this period, we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's probably a lot we've never discovered, there were a lot of different things going on. What becomes Christianity in this first 100 years would not be recognizable to any Christian today. Probably there were no churches that we think of in the same way. They were very small, home-based. There were small gatherings of Christians in these early times. Some of them were Jewish, most of them were not Jewish, and some of them were just considering themselves as following the teachings of a particular rabbi. Paul starts changing all of that. And then in this pre-Constantine period, there's more of things being written. But then with Constantine, things really begin to coalesce, become more rigid. And then we have the Eastern Church form with the center in Constantinople. And then the Roman Church with the center in Rome. And then we start having the traditions of Rome and Constantinople as the two centers of the Eastern and the Western churches. That's an incredibly superficial overview, but let's go to the next one now.
But that is it. You just gave. You sent me two. Did you send me?
The thing. Did you? Put
oh yeah, the diagram. Oh yes, the diagram.
The diagram.
All right.
Any questions about this before we go to that? Then maybe I should stop here and just see how people are.
There were a couple of questions.
Okay.
Rabbi.
All right. Sorry for.
No. Let's see. So I think you answered it, but we had a question: Rabbinic Judaism versus, you said versus what, or asked this, and that would be the biblical Israelite religion.
Good question. So biblical Israelite religion was based on sacrifices brought to the temple cult. How did you observe? This is a really important question, Ora. How did you observe religion in the biblical Israelite religion, right? How did you observe it? By and large, the center of biblical Israelite religion was the bringing of sacrifices to the temple for different things, for holidays, for Shabbat, to do repentance, to all these different offerings. So without the temple was the center of the religion. And who ran the temple? Who was the top religious, who were the religious leaders in the temple period? The priests, Kohanim. How did you become a Kohen? You had to be born into the family of a Kohen. You couldn't become a Kohen if you weren't in the family of a Kohen. And of course, this was only men. That goes without saying. And there were Kohanim, which were the priests, and then the Levite class, which were kind of the servants of the priests, but it was high level. It wasn't, but they took care of business. They were kind of the worker bees. But and how could you become a Levite? You had to be born into it. You couldn't go to school and study to become a Levite. So the temple was ruled by the Kohanim and the Levites one step below the Kohanim, but really the political class were the Kohanim. But the Levites and the Kohanim, guess what happened? They lived quite well. Guess what happened? If you have a system that's a dynastic system that goes from father to son rather than a system of who is the best to do a job, do I need to say what happens pretty quickly? Not necessarily qualified people. And guess what? They start gathering money. They start becoming powerful in all different kinds of ways. we in Jerusalem and on some of the trips to Jerusalem, we've actually gone to the burnt house, which is a house that belonged to somebody of this higher class that was burnt at the destruction of the temple. It's so exciting and thrilling to be in there because it's underneath the old is Renee here? Because now I have to be careful if I say something wrong. Whoops. If Renee's here.
I'm checking on you, Rabbi.
Okay, just if I say something wrong, Renee, correct me. Right? Isn't it?
No, it's perfect.
It's from
Perfect.
the burnt house is from 70, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah,
it's-
it was destroyed in 70. Yes.
It was destroyed in 70. Okay. I just, now I have to be really careful what I say. I forgot Renee's here. Renee is actually an expert on the Christian stuff. I forgot you're here, Renee. You actually know what you're saying. So correct me if I've said anything wrong. Renee, because she's French, also often leads Christian pilgrim groups in Israel. So she really knows the Christian history as well, in ways that I'm just faking it. So thank you, Renee, for being here. Correct me if I say anything wrong. Oops. Okay, so it shows that it was up on the hill overlooking the temple, and it was quite a luxurious house. I mean, you could see it had its own mikveh. It's quite luxurious. There was a lot of corruption, and guess what? Jesus called out that corruption, and that's where we see the differences between the Sadducees, the Tzaddukim in Hebrew, are that ruling class. And guess what? Jesus was part of a group, we imagine, much larger than just Jesus alone. But many people were very upset that there was a wealthy class. And you know the famous story of Jesus throwing over the
tables of the money changers in the temple.
Because think about it, right? If you were living in the north of Israel and you needed to come down to Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice, you wouldn't necessarily schlep a goat with you from the north of Israel. You'd bring whatever currency you'd have. You'd have to go to a money changer in Jerusalem to change the money into whatever the currency was in Jerusalem. There were usurious rates charged on the changing of money. And then you would go buy your goat that you would bring for a sacrifice. Well, guess who that system hurt pretty badly? Poor people. If you came down from the north of Israel and you were really poor and you didn't have a lot of money and you lost a lot of your money just in changing the money in order to get the goat, which you had to get, or the dove, or the whatever the animal was. So there were a lot of people that were very upset that there was this corrupt, dynastic political system that ruled the religious life of every Israelite person. And Jesus was part of a group called Pharisees, the Pharisees were the rabbinic class of people who were beginning to rebel against the priestly class and saying, you know what? We don't like this system and we think it's really economically unfair and unjust. And you know what? They were also saying, we're not so comfortable with animal sacrifice anymore. But they couldn't quite say that. But that's what they were starting to move towards, even while the temple still existed. So you have two systems of leadership in conflict. The system of the Sadducees, those running the temple religion, and the Pharisees, the rabbis, who were starting to say, you know what? We're not into this system anymore. It's economically unfair to poor people. And we're not so comfortable with animal sacrifice, but we can't quite say that, but we are uncomfortable with the corruption of the leadership of the Sadducees. Guess what? In 70, the temple is totally destroyed. So this all existed. The question from yesterday, the rabbinic class was emerging, and Jesus was a part of that emerging of a new class of rabbis. And the rabbinic class was in opposition to the priestly class. So you had two political systems. Forget the religious part. Who was going to be in charge? In some ways, there was a political debate. So that's why when I said yesterday, when the temple was destroyed, they could have said, okay, let's go back to our earlier system where you could build an altar anywhere you are. There were altars in Shiloh. There were altars in the north. There was an altar in Alexandria. Let's move the center outside of Jerusalem. But the rabbis didn't want to continue the animal sacrifice system altogether. So they said, oh, woe is us. We can't continue the animal sacrifice outside of Jerusalem. So we will replace the sacrificial system with prayer. And as the Jews were forced into diaspora, hundreds of thousands had to leave Jerusalem and were killed in 70. A rabbinic Judaism succeeded because it was portable, because it said, now the observance of Shabbat is not about sacrificing X number of goats and doves and things like that. Shabbat becomes about our observance of Shabbat, and it emerges over a few hundred years to what we know of Shabbat now. All right, Renee, how'd I do? Anything you want to correct or change or add to?
No, you're perfect, Rabbi. You're perfect.
Yeah, I've learned it all from Renee, so.
Sherry Dratfield has had her hand up for
Yeah.
a long time. She must be tired. Sherry.
No, I'm not. Simon's tired.
Hi. Rabbi, you said that the Christianity of the early period is so different from what it is today. How would you characterize the key differences?
Well, what my Christian colleagues would say, and I don't know if we have any on this call, but the Christian colleagues would say it wasn't hierarchical. It was church people. That was where, Dorina, you used that quote yesterday, where 2 or 3 gather, I will be found. It was much more home-based or small church fellowship. There was no hierarchy of a church. It was all people's personal relationships with Jesus. So there was no pomp and circumstance, so to speak. It was a very, very personal. What are you holding up, Harold? I can't. It's hard to read it.
I put this into the chat. This is the the Jewish annotated New Testament, which I have a very well-worn copy of. It's the standard text of the New Testament, but it has fascinating notes and essays by Rabbi Jill. Hold on. And if anyone's interested, if anyone's interested in that intersection of Judaism and proto-Christianity in the life of Jesus, I really cannot recommend this enough. It is fascinating in all of these different things. It's I put the link in the chat, and I've sent it out before, and I can send it out again. And so let's see. There are a lot of questions, Rabbi, and a lot in chat. We can do that. We can go to your chart. What would you like to do?
Let's take some questions and then we'll go to the chart. I think this is what we'll do for today, just because this is a big topic and it's really important.
Shep.
Rabbi, I understand all this, but how is it that all these disparate Jewish communities all over the world got the same ideas about having rabbis and getting rid of sacrifice?
Because it was
they did have sacrifice until the 20th century, but everybody else got rid of it and got into prayer. I mean, how did they all conform? I mean, it seems weird.
Because the diaspora, before 70 of the Common Era, there weren't Jews all over the world. There were Jews in Rome, but there weren't Jews all over the world. There were some Jews in North Africa, not a lot. So the diaspora is what spread out from there with those ideas. The divisions between Sephardic and Ashkenazic, and that didn't exist before, right? Everybody was pretty much located in the ancient Near East. Again, there's some important exceptions. We know Jews were in Rome because the Roman Empire was the empire in which Jews lived, and Jews were merchants even then. So Jews lived in Rome even before the enslaved Jews were brought there by after the destruction of the temple. But most of the Jews, and by the way, if you hear the correct reference to a person who is our ancestor from the Bible is Israelite, not Jewish. Technically, although I don't stick to that when I speak in the congregation because it gets confusing to people, but technically if we were to refer to Abraham or Isaiah, technically they're Israelites. They're technically not Jewish because Judaism didn't yet exist. Technically, like that's if you put, when you transliterate a chet with that little poop underneath. It's technical, but it's hard to understand.
Rabbi, right today, currently in Italy, the word for Jew is Hebreo, Hebrew. They don't use Jew or Israelite, they call Hebrews. It's the Hebrew bookstore, the Hebrew museum, it's all Hebrew. It's funny.
I think that's true in other languages too.
Right.
I think Hebrew is.
In French, it's like Hebreos is used.
Yeah.
By Zhrif, too.
We actually, I'd like to get Kristen on here. Someone who was raised Christian and had some comments here. Kristen Pilar Moore, are you here? Kristen, I know she was here. She raised her hand.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you are.
Okay, I thought I was unmuting. My question was, I was curious when you said that Jesus, did I hear that correctly, that Jesus was also a Pharisee?
Well, he objected to things the Pharisees were doing, which is why we get the anti-Pharisees thing. I was being a little bit broad, but Jesus came out of that same group of people who were also Pharisees.
I see. So, right. So that makes sense. Because there is criticism within groups, but that I did not realize that. Thank you for.
The Pharisees basically became the rabbinic class, which is why we as Jews are offended by the hostility to Pharisees in the New Testament sometimes, because it's sometimes a code word. It feels like it's a code word for rabbinic Judaism.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
And Rabbi, speaking about the way we speak about Christians, the difference between referring to the historical man Jesus, and which is his name, or his name would have been whatever,
Yeshua probably, or something like that.
And Christ, which comes from the Greek word for anointed, Christos, which then gets translated as the Messiah. And there were some questions earlier as to the difference between Jewish and Christian translations of the Hebrew scriptures. And the Christians are much more likely, when there is a word Moshiach or something about being anointed, to jump in with Christ, and when a Jewish translator will jump in with anointed.
For those of us who were back at Psalm 2, you'll remember the word Mishicho is in Psalm 2, and Jews being anointed was a part of the culture then for various things. It wasn't considered, but Christians will read that as Jesus, the anointed one, meaning Jesus. So you'll see that throughout the Psalms. And remember, for those of us who were studying Psalm 2 together, we had a big discussion about that, because that's a great example. Psalm 2 is very important in Christian liturgy, and because it's the first one that refers to Mashiach, which for us, Mashiach, also it just means anointed by oil, which can be done in various different for 4 various different reasons. It doesn't mean the Son of God. For Christians, it means the Son of God, the anointed one. So it has you read that psalm quite differently.
Well, and then there was, I believe it was Shep who pointed out in the chat that Christians are very careful to create a genealogy that links Jesus with David through Jesse.
And we do the same thing in our Mishnah, where we make a link between from Moses down through to the rabbis. It's important. Both traditions do that. And that's what I mean about arguing who is the legitimate heir. Both traditions spend a lot of time establishing legacy, because it's very important to say we are the ones who link all the way back. And
Sheldon Wertman has
the truth is both are true. Both are true, really.
Sheldon, are you there? Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Hold on one second. Let me drink something to wash it down.
Okay.
Is there somebody else while Sheldon's drinking?
Lori Spear then, while Sheldon will get
No,
ready.
I'm ready. I'm ready. I just was in the midst of having a little 10 o'clock.
Go ahead.
I happen to like what you're saying, Rabbi. I happen to, because what you did with King Constantine and changing the laws, that was...
He was actually an emperor. He had an empire.
Yes, I know.
These were the days of empires, yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, when you talk about the anointed one, if you ever listen to our great president, he thinks he's the anointed one. But that's something else. Going back all the way to starting with Jesus. And you talk about, we lived in what was when Moses came out of the land, and we just wandered. You know, we stayed when we crossed the Red Sea, whatever the number was, we basically, from what I learned, it could be wrong, and this is many years ago, and I also could have forgotten that we stayed as a group. And for whatever the reason was, the Levies, not the Levies, the Coins, as you talked about, they were basically like you, the head rabbi. But they didn't work. You work. And they have to eat. Some had farms, some didn't have farms. Most of them didn't. They stayed and prayed. They prayed over their flock.
They didn't pray. No, Kohanim didn't pray a lot. There were some prayers with the sacrifices, but they organized all the sacrifices. I wouldn't say they didn't work. I would just say that it was a dynasty, so it wasn't, people weren't qualified necessarily. And even we're told on the Avodah service on Yom Kippur, we say, remember, even part of the liturgy is, if the Kohen Gadol is a scholar himself, he will study, because some of them could have been actually intelligent. But if they're not a scholar, the scholars will study on their behalf. Well, that's the problem with dynastic political systems. The sons and the grandsons and the great-grandsons are not necessarily capable. Even if the original was, which isn't necessarily true, that a dynastic system is always a problem. What did the rabbis do that was so revolutionary? They did a lot of things revolutionary. But one was that they said, it did, of course, it was only men, so we're going to put that in that parentheses. That's a big.
That's correct. It was only men.
It is the ancient world. But they said it did not matter what your socioeconomic background was. If you were learned enough to teach, you became a respected teacher. That was what made Judaism, I believe, that meritocracy, so to speak, is what made Judaism survive 2,000 years. With all of the difficulties and all of the debates and the tensions and the schisms, and there were many major schisms in Jewish history. Sheldon, I need you to mute yourself, Sheldon, because it doesn't work when we both speak at the same time. And guess what? I'm the one that gets to control the muting. Sorry. I told you, being able to do that is my idea of the greatest. Anyway, so the ability to say, the quality of your ability to teach is what will make you a leader, not who your father is, completely transformed Judaism. Now, it doesn't mean that all of them were great people or decent people or all of them weren't, but it totally transformed what made for leadership in the community. And I say this again, there were major schisms throughout Jewish history. For people who say we've never been in a part of Jewish history where there weren't such hatred among Jews, it's not true. I could teach a whole course going through major schisms in Jewish history. But throughout history, from the time of the expulsion from Jerusalem in 70, the system was based on the ability to be a great teacher and a great scholar. And we have many examples of where some of the greatest came from profound poverty without a parent who taught them, without access to great schools, that it's so that, and in fact, they are held up. You might know the very famous story about Rabbi Akiva, who was from this period, by the way. Somebody asked, I saw in the chat, who were the early rabbis? So the very earliest period was the period of the Mishnah, which was around the time of Jesus to the period of 200. So you see, around this time up to Constantine was also a very fluid time for rabbinic Judaism. So this period of what we call the Mishnaic period, and it's interesting, Jewish history is, and I've said this before, but it's important to remember this, Jewish history is known by its literary periods, not by its kings. So we'll talk about the Mishnah. The Mishnaic period is a historical period. The Talmudic period is a historical period. The period of the Gaonim, the period of the Rishonim, they're all historical periods, and they're all the writers of that moment, which I just love that about Judaism. Anyway, the Mishnah period ends around 200 of the Common Era. Remember, Constantine is about 325. So this fluidity in both camps, so to speak, is going on. And those early rabbis are considered the Gedolim, the great rabbis. And our tradition in Jewish study is you can never contradict the generations that came before you. You can find, we call, derech akifa, kind of roundabout ways to change the results of their debates, but you can't say they were wrong. You could say, oh, they didn't know this, or they should have looked at that. So that first generation includes a Rabbi Akiva. Some of you might know or have heard of him. He was illiterate. He could not read a letter until he was 40 years old. And the story is told that he went to with the equivalent of a kindergarten, sat in the back of a class as an adult man, a 40-year-old man, would hang off the like little window on the top just to listen. And as he got stronger and stronger, he increased his knowledge. And can you imagine that? What model does that give us? If you don't know something, you as a beginner, you go wherever the beginner knowledge is, and there's no shame, because that's how you're going to learn. That's profound. He's held up in Jewish tradition as one of the greatest scholars of any time ever. And in fact, there's more to say about him, but just that model as opposed to power or fame, until we get to the Hasidic period, which is a whole different issue of leadership. But that's held up. He's held up as that kind of, okay, other questions, and
So
we're running out of time.
that makes us think of our Aleph class.
Exactly. That's why learning Torah, whatever level, is as significant as the most advanced scholar.
So I will say that it's 10:42, that we have a few more questions. The rabbi and I will stay after 10:45 for the new students, people who have joined this class since the break, to give you a little orientation of what we've been doing and how to get the most out of this class. So that's 10:45. We will not be continuing this conversation. I think we'll continue this conversation tomorrow. But Lori Spear has had her hand up for an awfully long time.
Okay, I think that the rabbi answered my question mostly.
Okay.
Who we have, because it was about who were the early rabbis and what was their socioeconomic background, and I think you handled that. Do we have, from looking at the Mishnah, any idea of who the very earliest rabbis?
Yes, we know who the earliest rabbis in the Mishnah are. Yes, we do. Were there rabbis before then? And again, what's the word rabbi exactly? That was an emerging concept itself. But yes, we know in the Mishnah, and Akiva is one of the oldest. We know the ones who are and I could even bring a chart. Harold and I can bring a chart. We know who that first generation was. We know the first three generations pretty clearly because the students quote their teachers. Do we know? But it's only those who made it into the Mishnah itself. There might have been others. You know, there's no comprehensive, exhaustive history. We have this text of the Mishnah, but the Mishnah is pretty clear who is being quoted, and we know roughly from their references when they lived. We can be pretty secure in knowing who the first 2-3 generations are, and then after that, it actually gets easier.
Thank you.
There is a fuzzy period though where we're the emerging. But what's important to understand, that one of the takeaways is that this is all happening before the temple is destroyed. It's not true to say there's some kind of, it's all temple cult, the temple's destroyed, and poof, Judaism pivots to rabbinic Judaism. They were both happening at the same time in tension, and there was a lot of tension, and I don't have time now. You know, I've told the famous story of Yochanan ben Zakkai, which is an important story for this period. But there's a lot of tension inside of Jerusalem with the Roman siege on Jerusalem about how to respond. And one of the profound things that I think we have a lot to learn from is that the rabbinic class was not into fighting the military battle against the Romans, that they understood that was a losing, this was an empire that would crush physical resistance. But anyway, I'll stop there because of time, and maybe tomorrow Harold will look at the big diagram.
Okay.
But if you have other questions, remember them, okay, and bring them or send them, put them up on the Facebook group. And I hope everybody, the new folks, are also on the Facebook group.
Yes, so we'll discuss that at our orientation.
Okay, perfect.
Adria.
Okay.
And we made a mistake. Today is Thursday. There is no class tomorrow. But there will be class on Monday.
Yes. So everyone has the weekend to go to Wikipedia and get their books and do all their research.
And I'll
So-
see everybody at Shul tomorrow night.